Hey everyone, and welcome back. This is one of a series of videos looking at the US Constitution and American politics. In this video, we'll explore the historical events that led to the American Revolution and ultimately to the drafting of the US Constitution. Specifically, we'll consider the political, economic, and social conditions that set the stage for the Revolution and look at the specific events that led to American independence. There's a lot to unpack, so let's get to it. I want to start by setting the stage. It's the late 1760s, and life in the colonies proceeds apace. The population of the colonies was relatively diverse, at least by European standards at the time. While the majority of colonists were English, there were also large numbers of Dutch, German, Scottish, and Irish settlers. And while we tend to associate the early colonists with the Puritans of New England, there were in fact also a large number of Anglicans, especially in the southern colonies, Quakers in Pennsylvania, and sizable settlements of Catholics, Jews, and Huguenots, among others. The population of the colonies grew rapidly through the 18th century, increasing from fewer than 5,000 people in 1630 to 250,000 in 1700 to more than 2.5 million by 1780. The rapid pace of colonization fueled conflict and tensions with the native tribes, who were increasingly pushed out of their lands to make room for the new settlers. At the same time, the population of native tribes was decimated by disease, enslavement, and outright warfare, declining from an estimated 50 million before contact to fewer than 10 million by 1780. This increase in settler population included large numbers of enslaved persons, particularly in the southern colonies, and enslaved persons accounted for more than 40% of the population of states like South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia at independence. Sharp regional differences existed between the colonies. The economies of the northern or New England colonies like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut were largely focused on fishing, shipbuilding, and ironworks, as well as small-scale subsistence agriculture. The economies of the middle colonies, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania, were characterized by a mix of farming and commerce. While most of the southern colonies, Georgia, Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas, were heavily reliant on cash crops like indigo, tobacco, and later cotton and plantation agriculture, and the exploitation of enslaved labor that made that system so profitable. The early colonies even varied in their political structures. By the time of the Revolution, most of the colonies, including Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Virginia, and the Carolinas, operated as royal colonies, directly governed by the British Crown. In such colonies, the British monarch would appoint a governor who would often be advised by a local council. These colonies were intended, at least by the British, to generate wealth for England. Others, like Pennsylvania and Maryland, were proprietary colonies governed by individuals or companies granted the land by the Crown. Such colonies were governed by a Lord Proprietor and granted a charter by the king, who then governed essentially as an independent sovereign, and they were responsible to the shareholders of the company that had invested in the colony. Still others, like Rhode Island and Connecticut, were charter colonies, which were permitted a degree of independent government established by the charter and grant issued by the Crown. This status afforded the colonies greater independence and political liberty, essentially allowing the colony to engage in a form of self-government. In most cases, though, the distance from Great Britain and the extremely slow nature of communication and transportation at the time afforded the colonies considerable independence. Indeed, local government played a crucial role in the daily lives of the colonists, with town meetings in New England and county courts and the southern colonies serving as important centers of political decision-making. For the most part, the colonies operated under a policy of salutary neglect, which allowed them a degree of autonomy in their internal affairs. Put simply, salutary neglect was the 18th century British policy of avoiding strict enforcement of parliamentary laws, especially trade laws, in the Americas, in exchange for which the colonies were expected to remain loyal to the Crown and to contribute to the economic growth of Britain. However, as tensions between the colonies and Great Britain increased in the mid-18th century, the British government began to assert greater control over the colonies, leading to growing dissatisfaction that would ultimately spark the Revolution. And it was this shift away from a policy of salutary neglect towards a more interventionist policy that sparked resentment among the colonists. That transition began around the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, which in the Americas was dubbed the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War pit the British Empire against the French Empire, with each side drawing on Native American allies in their fighting. More specifically, the British were allied with the Iroquois Confederation, while the French drew support from the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Algonquin, Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Shawnee, among others. The Cherokee initially fought alongside the British, but that relationship broke down, leading to the Anglo-Cherokee War. The French and Indian War, which lasted from 1754 to 1763, was rooted in the long-standing rivalry between France and England. However, its proximate causes can be found in competing French and British claims over the territory and resources of the Ohio River Valley. What's more important, however, is the way in which the outcome of the war influenced the direction of politics in the American colonies in several important ways. First, the French and Indian War provided an important training ground for both the political ideologies and the future American leaders that would play a pivotal role in the Revolution. For example, George Washington famously fired the first shot of the French and Indian War, and Benjamin Franklin's iconic Join or Die political cartoon was created to unify the British colonies in the French and Indian War. Second, the Treaty of Paris that concluded the war ended French colonial claims in the Americas, transferring most French colonial possessions to the British Crown and opening vast new areas of the Americas for British colonization. Before 1754, large portions of the interior of North America were claimed by France. This included not just the contested region of Ohio, but larger portions of Atlantic Canada and land that stretched all the way from Montana and Dakota in the north to Louisiana in the south. Those claims were divided between the Spanish and British after the end of the war. At the same time, the end of the French presence in the Americas led to more direct tensions between British colonists and the Native Americans, particularly those tribes bordering on the British settlements. For tribes that had been allied with France, the withdrawal of France from North America left them isolated and vulnerable to British expansion. And while that vulnerability would be limited by the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which was intended to outline a western boundary for British settlement delineating all territory west of the line as an Indian reserve, any such protections or guarantees would be short-lived. Finally, the war itself left Britain with a massive debt, forcing the British Crown to find new sources of revenue, particularly from the colonies. From the British perspective, it was only right that the colonies should pay for their own defense, which included the costs of the French and Indian War. But from the colonists' perspective, such taxes would quickly become a focal point for rebellion and revolution. To help finance the cost of the war and to help pay for the ongoing British military presence to protect the colonies, the British government imposed a series of taxes on the colonies. These included the Sugar Act of 1764, which imposed a tax on sugar and molasses, the Stamp Act of 1765, which imposed a tax on legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, and dice, and the Townshend Act of 1767, which imposed a variety of taxes on a number of goods. Not surprisingly, these new taxes were not well received among the colonists, who decried the taxes not just for their economic impact, but for the imposition of taxes by a parliament in which they had no formal representation. Indeed, the rallying cry of no taxation without representation became a focal point for colonial opposition to the taxes. In response to the taxes, the colonists engaged in protests, boycotts, and petitions, escalating tensions between Britain and the colonies. The boycott of British goods was initially effective, leading the British Parliament to withdraw the Stamp Act in 1766 and the Townshend Acts in 1770. Other acts of British Parliament passed during this period curtailed the colonists' liberties. The Quartering Act of 1765 required colonial legislatures to provide barracks or other accommodations in inns, livery stables, alehouses, or the like for British soldiers stationed in the colonies. It also required the colonial governments to furnish the soldiers with firewood, bedding, candles, cooking utensils, salt, and a daily ration of beer, cider, or rum. At the end of the French and Indian War, The British government stationed some 10,000 British soldiers in the colonies, the first time such a force was permanently stationed there. The Tea Act of 1773 attempted to curtail the smuggling of Dutch tea into the Americas in an effort to protect the British East India Company's monopoly on the tea trade. While neither the Tea Act nor the Quartering Act were formally taxes on the colonists nevertheless viewed them as such. Indeed, Sam Adams argued, is not the Quartering Act taxing the colonies as effectively as the Stamp Act? Amid growing tension over taxes and representation, there was also growing unease between the British soldiers and the colonists. Remember that more than 10,000 soldiers had been permanently stationed in the colonies, in part to protect the colonies from foreign aggression, but equally to keep order and put down the rebellious movements inside them. Massachusetts in particular had been a hotbed for anti-tax protest, and as a result, the British government had expanded its garrison there. On the evening of March 5, 1770, a confrontation between British soldiers and colonists on King Street grew out of hand. A group of colonists were taunting and throwing snowballs at a group of British soldiers guarding the customs house. As the group grew, some colonists began throwing rocks at the soldiers. In response, several soldiers panicked and fired their muskets into the crowd. Several colonists were shot in the melee, including Crispus Attucks, an American sailor of African and Native American descent, killing him instantly and making him the first casualty in the American Revolution. Eventually, the crowd dispersed and the British soldiers were put on trial. Their attorney was none other than John Adams, who would later become the second President of the United States. In all, 8 soldiers were put on trial for murder, 6 were acquitted, where 2 were found guilty of manslaughter and received lighter sentences. But the event, which was called the Incident on King Street by British authorities, better became known as the Boston Massacre among the colonists, further mobilized anti-British sentiment in the colonies. Protests against the Tea Act were similarly widespread, culminating in the Boston Tea Party when, on December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty snuck aboard 3 British East India ships and threw 342 chests of tea worth more than $1.7 million in current terms into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party and the colonial boycotts and protests against British policies provoked sharp responses by the British government. In response, the British Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which in the colonies were generally referred to as the Intolerable Acts. Passed in 1774, the Intolerable Acts were directed primarily against Massachusetts and indeed were intended to make an example of the colony, with the British Parliament hoping that such punitive measures would reverse the trend of colonial resistance to parliamentary authority. Specifically, the Intolerable Acts included 4 measures. The Boston Port Act closed the Port of Boston until the colonists paid for the tea they destroyed at the Boston Tea Party, and the king was satisfied that order had been returned to the city. The Massachusetts Government Act unilaterally revoked Massachusetts' charter and brought the colony under direct control of the British government. All colonial officials were to be directly appointed by the governor, Parliament, or the king, and no town meetings could be held without the approval of the governor. The Administration of Justice Act permitted the governor to expatriate accused royal officials to Great Britain if he believed they would not receive a fair trial in Massachusetts. And finally, the Quartering Act, which applied not just to Massachusetts but to all British colonies, was an update to the earlier Quartering Act of 1765. The expanded act permitted British soldiers to be housed in any building at the discretion of the governor if the colonial legislatures failed to provide adequate housing under the original Quartering Act. The Coercive Acts did not have their desired impact. Far from curtailing colonial resistance, the acts mobilized colonial opposition. Many colonists viewed the acts as a violation of their constitutional rights, their natural rights, and their colonial charters. Indeed, subjects across the 13 colonies viewed the acts as an example of unnecessarily cruel punishment and as a threat to the liberty of the colonies. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia described the acts as a most wicked system for destroying the liberty of America. The Boston Port Act was viewed as a system of collective punishment, punishing all the residents of Boston for the actions of a few members of the Sons of Liberty. The Massachusetts Government Act was decried as a violation of the rights of liberty and self-governance and a rejection of the colonial legal system, effectively putting British soldiers and colonial officials above the law. Indeed, George Washington famously called the act the Murder Act because he believed it would allow British officials to harass Americans and escape justice. Collectively, the Intolerable Acts primarily served to galvanize opposition to British rule. This opposition was largely mobilized through the Committees of Correspondence, an underground network of communication originally established by Samuel Adams, which included an estimated 7,000 to 8,000 people across the colonies who supported independence. The Committees of Correspondence operated as an informal network, collecting information on merchants who attempted to defy colonial boycotts on British goods, identifying those opposed to independence, and generally undermining British rule. Members of the Committee of Correspondence played a central role in the First Continental Congress, which was held in September and October 1774 in Philadelphia. Of the original 13 colonies, only Georgia did not participate in the First Continental Congress. While generally unified in their dissatisfaction with British rule, the participants at the First Continental Congress were divided into several camps. A conservative camp led by John Jay, John Dickinson, and others were focused on developing policies that might pressure the British Parliament to rescind the Intolerable Acts and to find a means to reconcile the relationship between Great Britain and the colonies. A more radical camp that included Patrick Henry, Roger Sherman, Samuel Adams, and John Adams, among others, favored developing a more decisive statement on the rights and liberties of the colonies, with the ultimate goal of protecting the rights of the colonists against the abuses of British parliamentary authority, including, if necessary, achieving independence from Great Britain. After nearly 2 months of debate, the First Continental Congress adopted the more conservative approach. The Congress endorsed the Suffolk Resolves, a measure originally passed by several counties in Massachusetts that included a declaration of grievances, called for a boycott of British goods imported into the colonies, and urged each colony to establish its own militia. It also passed a declaration of resolves and petition to the king, which included an extensive list of grievances and called for the repeal of the Intolerable Acts. The Congress further threatened to stop exporting goods to Great Britain if their demands were not met, and agreed to meet in a Second Continental Congress the following year to take further action if necessary. The Second Continental Congress would meet under very different circumstances. Less than 6 months after the conclusion of the First Continental Congress, direct military conflict between the colonial militias and the British military would break out. On April 19, 1775, the battles of Lexington and Concord would become the first battles of the Revolutionary War. The battles took place as colonial militia confronted British regulars who were on a mission to find stored weapons and ammunition. And while the order of battle is not important, the impact of the battles of Lexington and Concord certainly were. The Second Continental Congress would meet in the aftermath of the battles of Lexington and Concord. Following those battles, the Second Continental Congress looked very different than the first. It no longer sought to reestablish good relations with Britain. Instead, it functioned largely as a de facto national government, raising armies, directing strategy, appointing diplomats to court allies, and mobilizing popular support for the revolution. The Continental Congress also raised funds and borrowed money to help finance the war. They voted to create a Continental Army out of the Massachusetts militia units that had surrounded Boston in the aftermath of the battles of Lexington and Concord, and named George Washington as the commanding general. They approved a declaration of causes outlining many of the reasons why the colonies had taken up arms against Britain. And perhaps most famously, the Second Continental Congress unanimously approved the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. Written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence outlines the reasons why the colonies regarded themselves as independent and sovereign states, no longer subject to British colonial rule. And while we talk about the Declaration of Independence in more detail elsewhere, it's important to remember that the two key principles of American government, namely the idea of equal and unalienable rights and the idea of government based on the consent of the governed, are clearly found here. This was not the first time that the colonists had developed such an argument. Indeed, Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense had been published nearly 6 months earlier and had received wide readership across the colonies. In it, Paine endorses the ideas of Enlightenment social contract theorists, arguing that government is a necessary evil to maintain society, but that tyranny must be avoided. Paine argues that the colonies should be independent from Britain and proposes a system of government he believed would be capable of protecting individual rights and liberties. It's hard to underestimate the impact that Paine's pamphlet had on revolutionary sentiment in the colonies. More than 100,000 copies were in circulation, 1 copy for every 25 people in the colonies, in addition to numerous reprints and summaries that circulated. The Second Continental Congress would continue to meet and function as the first government of the United States through most of the Revolutionary War period. It was ultimately disbanded in March of 1781, but not before it undertook its final act of passing and seeing through ratification of the Articles of Confederation. The Revolutionary War would effectively end in August of 1781, when the Continental Army and its French allies forced the British garrison at Yorktown to surrender. While negotiating the peace treaty that resulted in the Treaty of Paris would not be concluded until September 3, 1783, the revolution was effectively over and the United States had been created. That's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.